All right, let's jump right in. We're going to talk about Brazil 100 years ago. And believe me, it was a wild place. It was a nation of incredible contrasts, where the future and the past were colliding in a really spectacular way. You could almost say it was like two different countries living under one flag. And to really get how big those contrasts were, let's start with this number 80%. That's how many Brazilians back in the 1920s couldn't even write their own name. I mean, just think about that for a second. This wasn't some small issue, it was the reality for the vast majority of people. So, picture this. You've got a country of 30 million people, and it's being pulled in two completely different directions. You have this tiny, super wealthy group just rocketing into the 20th century, while almost everyone else is living in a world still defined by farming, where getting an education was a luxury most people couldn't even dream of.
Now, to really get a feel for the time, we gotta talk about money. The currency back then was the reais. And get this, a single chicken could cost you 2,000 reais. It just gives you a sense of a totally different economic universe, one that was fueling both that glittering city life and the really deep poverty.
Okay, so first, let's take a trip to one side of that great divide, the booming coastal cities. We're talking about places like Rio de Janeiro, which was the nation's capital back then, and a fast-growing Sao Paulo. In these cities, man, it felt like life was speeding up, just accelerating into a whole new modern age. And you could literally see this change just by looking at what people were wearing. Forget about that old stuffy Victorian look, the painful corsets and dresses that dragged on the ground. That was out. The 1920s woman had shorter dresses that showed her legs, no more corsets, and those super stylish cloche hats. It was more than just fashion. It was a statement. It was freedom you could wear. And speaking of modern, what screams the future more than a car? Well, the very first automobiles were starting to be put together right there in São Paulo. And this was such a huge deal that people would actually gather at the factories just to watch these incredible machines get built. It was a public spectacle, a symbol of progress for everyone to see. The big cities were also getting noticed by the rest of the world. There's this great story about when King Albert I of Belgium came to visit. Instead of being all formal and stuffy, he just went for a swim at Copacabana Beach like a regular guy. The people absolutely loved it. So much so that it inspired a hit carnival song that year, with these hilarious lyrics that basically celebrated him telling royal etiquette to get lost. And of course, we can't talk about Brazil without talking about football. Even 100 years ago, it was already a national obsession. The state championships were a massive deal. And you can see right here, the historic rivalries we know today were already starting to brew. In 1922, Corinthians took the title in São Paulo, while two different teams, both named America, were champs in Rio and Minas Gerais. But everything we've talked about so far, that's only half the story. Now we're going to leave all that glitter and excitement behind and head inland, deep into the vast, rugged heart of Brazil, a totally different world, one of coffee barons and bandits. Which leads to a really crucial question, doesn't it? The new cars, the fancy imported clothes, the grand buildings in Rio. Where did all that money come from? It certainly didn't just appear out of thin air. The answer, in one word, was coffee. That was Brazil's black gold, the engine that was powering the entire national economy. The government even stepped in to keep coffee prices high, which meant there was this constant river of money flowing from the countryside to pay for all the modernization happening in the cities. But while the coffee barons down in São Paulo were getting incredibly rich, a completely different story was playing out far away in the dry, harsh backlands of the Northeast, the Sertão. And up there, life wasn't about progress and parties. Nope. It was about survival. And this tough environment gave rise to something totally unique known as the cangaço. Now, this wasn't just simple crime. It was way more complex. It was a kind of social banditry with these armed groups of outlaws called cangaceiros who roamed the landscape and lived by their own set of rules. The life of a cangaceiro was tough. They'd raid the huge farms owned by the wealthy landowners and were in a constant state of war with the state police. But here's the twist. They often shared what they took with the poor, which gave them this kind of Robin Hood reputation. And it was in this world that a young man named Virgolino Ferreira da Silva, who would soon become the legendary Lampião, was just getting his start. So let's bring these two worlds back together. Because what you see when you look at 1920s Brazil isn't really one country. It's two. And the deep, enduring divide between them is what shaped the nation's entire identity. So there you have it, the tale of two Brazils. On one hand, you've got the urban elites enjoying European fashion, new cars, and professional football. On the other, the rural reality, an agrarian economy, extreme poverty, and social banditry. It was modernity clashing with tradition, immense wealth built on the backs of the poor, all happening inside a single border.
And that brings us to the final question. A whole century has gone by. So much has changed. But when you look at the deep social and economic divides that are still here, you have to ask yourself, how much of that tale of two Brazils is still with us today?